Hello and welcome to the cardiovascular system. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the heart, the vessels going to and from the heart and throughout the body, as well as blood. So the function of the cardiovascular system, kind of in total, is going to be for transportation. This is through your blood. You're going to have the transportation of oxygen, carbon dioxide, which is a waste, nutrients, and hormones. The other purposes are going to be protection, so such as the immune system, so think of like your white blood cells, antibodies, as well as chemical signals are going to be transported through the cardiovascular system. And then regulation of your temperature, pH, water, and electrolytes. There are two primary circuits through the cardiovascular system. These are going to include the pulmonary circuit, which are going to be where you have gas exchange going on in the lungs, so dropping off carbon dioxide and picking up oxygen. So this is going to go hand in hand with the respiratory system, which we will talk about eventually. And then you have the second circuit, which is going to be the systemic circuit, which is going to be essentially everything excluding the pulmonary circuit, so everywhere else. Some key blood vessels to know, just kind of in general. Arteries are going to be, in most diagrams, what is labeled in red. Arteries are going to carry blood away from the heart, and the way I like to remember it is away, arteries away. Veins are going to bring blood back to the heart. Now, kind of a misconception about arteries and veins is that you can classify each by the type of blood that they carry. There is the majority of the arteries are going to carry high oxygenated blood, while veins are going to carry low oxygenated blood. Now keep in mind of how I'm phrasing that. Veins are not going to carry no oxygen. Even in your veins, you still have a little bit of oxygen in that blood. It's just very low. But that is not a good way to remember it. So again, I say arteries are away from the heart and veins are going to bring blood back to the heart. There are a few arteries and veins that don't really follow the high oxygen, low oxygen kind of misconception. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the heart and the vessels associated with it specifically here in just a minute. The other blood vessels that you need to know are going to be between your arteries and veins, and those are capillaries. Capillaries are going to be tiny and thin-walled. This is where you're going to have most of the nutrients and gas exchanges occurring. They are very important and very, very small, and we'll talk about those a little bit more here in just a minute. So arterioles and venules are going to be the smaller form of arteries and veins. Arterioles are going to be what determine blood pressure, so kind of make a little note of that. And that is where you're going to have the majority of your blood pressure coming from. Venules are going to be like small veins that carry blood away from capillaries. Arterioles bring blood into the capillaries. And then you have two terms here, vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Vasoconstriction is going to reduce blood flow and increase blood pressure. Vasodilation is going to do kind of the opposite. It's going to increase flow and decrease blood pressure. And then do know that blood will flow from arterioles to capillaries to venules. So moving on into a little bit more about capillaries. Again, capillaries are very small. They're not much bigger than a single red blood cell. So if you can imagine the size of a single red blood cell being very, very tiny, you can imagine that capillaries are equally as tiny. This is going to reduce the flow rate going through the capillaries because they are so small. But the reason for this, as well as the capillaries being very thin-walled, so they're very, very thin, it's going to allow for the exchange of gases. So those red blood cells going through the capillaries are going to drop off oxygen and pick up carbon dioxide from the surrounding tissue. When we get to the lymphatic system, capillaries are very important in that system, because in that exchange, and because there is so much exchange going on, you have fluids that are being exchanged out into the surrounding tissues from the capillaries. That fluid, known as lymph, is not good if it stays in the tissue. If it stays in the surrounding tissues and isn't taken away, it can cause an expansion of those tissues, sometimes the degradation of organs, sometimes the shutdown of organs. So you have the lymphatic system in place to kind of pick up what the capillaries leave. So kind of keep that in mind, make a little note of it now, and then we'll talk about that a little bit more in one of the next chapters. So a little bit about blood pressure. As I said before, your arteries and arterioles are going to determine your blood pressure. And blood pressure is classified as the force of blood against the arterial walls. This is due to the pulse of blood ejected from the heart and is determined by the diameter of your arterioles. High blood pressure, problems that it can cause, because it's not a good thing, causes damage to endothelial cells that line your arterioles. These damages to those cells are going to release nitric oxide. What nitric oxide does is it encourages the smooth muscle tissue within the arteries to relax, which is going to help dilate the vessel. Now, low blood pressure is going to essentially happen in the reverse of that. But I just want you to know high blood pressure more than anything, and make a note that high blood pressure, if it is consistent, is not a good thing. That's why there is high blood pressure medication. So talking about pressure and blood flow in the veins, because remember what we were talking about before is going to be in the arteries and arterioles. When it comes to your veins, veins contain valves. These valves are going to be folds in the inner lining of the veins. That is called the tunica intima, but you don't need to know that. Just make a little mental note. It's just the inner lining of veins, and they're going to be pointing in the direction of blood flow. You don't want it to be the blood flowing down this way and the valves pointing up this way. Blood would get trapped in that little crevice there. So they are pointed in the direction of the blood flow so that everything is nice and streamlined coming in. If the valves don't work properly, you can get things called varicose veins. There's a little picture there over to the side, as well as a diagram showing not normal blood flow and how that's going to look. Varicose veins are going to be a little bit more common in the thighs and legs. It's those very dark purple kind of spider webbing that you can kind of get. Normally, older people have a tendency to get these. I haven't seen them too much on younger people, but they can be surgically removed in some capacity, kind of interesting. But that is when you have the valves not working properly or closing properly. Hemorrhoids are also an example of when your valves don't work properly. They form in venous networks of the anal canal. So these are going to be kind of bulging veins, if you will, when it comes to the anal canal. They're pretty common in women who have given birth, as well as if you're kind of bearing down a little bit hard during a bathroom trip, potentially having some problems in that area can cause hemorrhoids. So that's kind of an overall in general over the cardiovascular system. We're going to move into the heart specifically now, and we are going to answer the question, why do heartbeats make a lumped up noise? So if you've ever put your head to someone's chest, and if you feel like doing that right now, if you have someone near you, or even a pet, put your ear to their chest and you can hear their heart noises. We'll explain why that happens and what it is. So a few facts about your heart. One, let's talk about the functions. So the functions of the heart specifically is to generate blood pressure, to route blood, so this is to kind of push blood through the body, routing blood, and to regulate your blood supply. The size of your heart is roughly the size of your fist. Now, if you're a female, biologically female like me, chances are you have a smaller hand than, say, a biological male. A biological male is typically going to be bigger than a female, and this is going to mean that that heart needs to be bigger as well. Females have smaller hearts in general, but again, you can kind of use the size of your fist as a kind of rule of thumb, if you will, for how big your heart is. Likewise, if you take your fist, go down kind of to the middle where you have your manubrium, so remember that top bone of the sternum, and you go a little bit to the left. So think about when you put your hand over your heart when you're saying the pledge. It's going to be a little bit in that area, but more a little bit centered than you think. So it's not completely like way over here. It's going to be just a little off center to the left. The average weight of a heart is going to be about 1 pound, but again, that can vary on the size of the person, as well as if there are different conditions affecting whether or not you have an enlarged heart or a smaller heart than normal. And again, we talked about the location there, but it is going to be inside something called the pericardial sac. This is going to be a little kind of a little bag, if you will, that's going to surround your heart. And it's going to be located in a cavity called the mediastinum. So this is going to be a kind of a subcavity within the thoracic cavity. Remember, the thoracic cavity is going to be within your chest. The mediastinum is just a special spot for your heart to go. So let's talk about the heart. The apex is going to be the pointed inferior portion of the heart. This part of your heart is going to rest on your diaphragm. Your diaphragm is going to be that muscle that separates your thoracic cavity from your abdominal cavity. This muscle is also going to help you breathe, but it's a big kind of almost looks like an umbrella in my opinion, but it spans the entire kind of circumference of your chest essentially, but only like a top portion. It's almost like a lid, if you will. The base of the heart is going to be this topmost portion. If I could get my little guy to write here, this is the base. The base is going to be the top, so don't let that confuse you. A lot of people think base means it's at the bottom, but the apex is at the bottom for the heart. The base is up at the top. The pericardium, again, we have talked about on the last slide, is the little sac or membrane that is going to surround the heart. And it is made up of a few layers. You don't need to know these layers. Just know that there is fluid between some of these layers, and that is called the pericardial fluid. I want you to think of the pericardial fluid as being sort of like a lubricant, because that's what it is. It's a lubricant that's going to reduce friction as your heart beats. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever had this, where maybe your mom, or I don't know, my dad never did it, but maybe your dad did, or maybe a significant other or brother or sister, maybe a friend, and they're rubbing maybe like your face or your shoulder or something, and they just keep doing the same movement over and over and over and over, and they're not moving their hand. And as comforting as that is, if they don't move their hand to another area to kind of rub, you get that friction where it's nice and hot and uncomfortable. This fluid is going to act as that lubricant so that your heart does not have any friction going on, because it's going to consistently beat, hopefully throughout your life. And with that beating, it would cause friction if we didn't have that fluid. It's very important. If you have inflammation of the pericardium, that is called pericarditis. That is not a good thing. You don't want that. Not good. And then we need to talk about the auricles. I always think of the auricles as being kind of these fatty little ears hanging off the sides of the heart. they are going to increase the capacity of the chambers underneath. And you'll kind of see that here in the next few slides. All right, so here we have a heart cut in half. Now do keep in mind that we are looking at this heart kind of straight on. So we are looking at the front of the heart. And do keep in mind that this is the model's heart. So this is going to be the right side of the heart, and this is going to be the left side of the heart, and you're looking at the front. So the atria are going to be the two chambers that are at the topmost portion of the heart. We have our right atrium and our left atrium. These are the most superior chambers. They are going to be the chambers that receive blood from the body. So wherever in the body that it is coming from, it is receiving blood. For the right atrium, it's going to receive blood from the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. These two veins are going to hold a heck ton of blood, all right? So they're bringing in all the blood from the upper body and your lower body, all of it, all that blood. The left atrium is going to receive blood from these veins called the left pulmonary veins, and let's see over here, the right pulmonary veins. These are going to be veins that are coming from your lungs. So the blood that the right atrium is going to receive is going to be low oxygen. From the left, we are receiving blood from the pulmonary veins, and that is going to be really highly oxygenated blood. From the atrium, we are going to pass through these special little valves here, and we will talk about these valves in just a little bit. But these chambers down here in kind of the inferior portion of the heart are going to be our ventricles. So the one I'm circling right now is the right ventricle, and here we have the left ventricle. These ventricles, these chambers, are going to be super duper important because they are going to push blood through these larger vessels, blood vessels. Specifically, the right ventricle is going to push blood up into the pulmonary trunk. And the pulmonary trunk is then going to split and go to each lung. The left ventricle is going to push blood up, and you can't see it because this little pulmonary trunk is here, but you can see the valve to it right there. That is going to push blood into the aorta. What is incredibly special about the left ventricle is going to be that it pushes blood through your entire body. So this left ventricle is a little bit thicker and a little bit stronger, and when it pumps, meaning it contracts to push blood out of it, it is going to contract with an especially hard force. That blood that is being ejected from that ventricle is going to then be shot through the entire body. And specifically, you have this very special vessel, which I've mentioned before, the aorta. The aorta is the start to all the blood in your body, all the blood vessels in your body. So it's kind of cool. What is going to separate our two ventricles is going to be, and I do apologize, my drawing here is a little bit messy now, but what separates these two ventricles is the interventricular septum. So kind of keep that in mind. We do have a separation between our ventricles. So here's a nice diagram showing the heart all together. It's not cut in half or anything, and it is showing our auricles here and over here. Like I said, those are kind of, they look like little fatty ears to me, kind of hanging off the top of the heart. You will notice that you do have fat surrounding the heart. You don't want too much fat, but it is important to have fat around your heart. We have that superior vena cava up here going into the right atrium. Remember, we're going to shoot blood through a valve to go into the right ventricle. From there, we're going to go up into the pulmonary trunk. We're going to come back, and you can't see through the pulmonary veins, which are then going to go into the left atrium over here, into the left ventricle, and then up and out through the aorta. So talking about some of these main vessels into and out of the heart, which we've already discussed, but it's good to have definitions regardless. You have that superior and inferior vena cava bringing low oxygen blood into our right atrium. And then we have our pulmonary trunk going out to our pulmonary arteries, which are going to go to the lungs. Once that blood is oxygenated, they're going to come back in through our left and right pulmonary veins, here and here, into the left atrium. We are then going to go into the left ventricle and then out through the aorta. And I know you guys are going to get tired of hearing me say the order that blood flows through the heart, but I do want you to know it, so make sure that you get that down, and here in just a minute I do have a slide that goes through that very concisely. So valves. Valves of the heart are very, very important. If your valves are malfunctioning, that means you're having blood leaking through or not coming through enough. These valves are very, very important, and so important that that is what makes the lubbed up noise when you hear someone's heart beating in their chest. It's very, very important, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So these valves are going to close to prevent or open to allow blood flow. Obviously, they're kind of like little gates or doors. You have two atrioventricular valves. These are going to be the valves that are between the atria and the ventricles. The first is going to be the tricuspid valve. This is going to be on the right side. On the left, you're going to have the mitral or bicuspid valve. You can remember it either way. I'd suggest bicuspid, but if you can remember mitral a little bit better, that's fine with me. But tricuspid and bicuspid kind of makes sense to me. Just remember that in the order of things, tri is first, bi is second, but that is going to be this valve here. And remember, these are just separating the atria from the ventricles. Now, what's kind of important is what is attached to these valves, and that is your papillary muscles and the chordae tendineae. So the papillary muscles are these little kind of projections here that you can see within the ventricle. And then the chordae tendineae are going to be these stringy bits that are connecting the valve and the muscle. As these muscles relax or contract, it's going to cause tension or relaxation on the chordae tendineae. This is going to cause the valve to either close or to be kind of pulled open. So when it is contracted, it's going to be pulled open, and when those chordae tendineae and papillary muscles relax, it's going to snap shut. The semilunar valves are going to be the valves that are between the ventricles and the main vessels that they are attached to. So for the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, that is going to be this guy here, the pulmonary semilunar valve. And so that is a long name, but I do want you to know it. And then, of course, the way that I just made that little circle there is going to cover up the other valve I want to show you. So I'll just put a little star here. Remember, that is the pulmonary semilunar valve. And then we have from the left ventricle to the aorta is the aortic semilunar valve. These are going to look a little different than each other. All of them are a little bit different, and we can see here in this graphic that they all look a little bit different. So this is from a superior view looking down at a cross section of the heart, specifically looking at the valves. So we have our pulmonary valve and our aortic valve, and you can see these three little kind of leaflets here, which are going to be three crescent moon-shaped cusps that are going to allow blood to be ejected, but no blood to flow back in. So that's very important. And then you can see the difference between the mitral or bicuspid valve and the tricuspid valve. So the mitral or bicuspid is just going to have two little leaflets there, and the tricuspid has three. So this is, again, a nice little diagram showing the heart cut in half, showing all those valves. You can use it to kind of draw things out if you so desire. If not, just ignore it, I guess. And again, another graphic showing that superior view of the valves opening and closing. Do make a note here on this slide that when the atrioventricular valves are open, the semilunar valves are closed, and vice versa. You can't have everything be open at the same time. Blood wouldn't flow through. So the way blood moves through the heart, you have to have one chamber closed while the other one's open. You have to have the vessels closed off while the chambers fill up with blood. So that's very important to make note of. And then this little graphic here at the bottom is showing relaxed versus contracted papillary muscles attached to those chordae tendineae. Moving on to the layers of the heart wall, which personally I think would be a pretty cool band name. We have the epicardium, which is going to be the most external layer. Do know that it is smooth, slippery, and contains blood vessels supplying the heart with blood. It is made up of two layers, and just know that one of those layers is the pericardium, and the second layer is going to be fibroelastic and adipose tissue, so fat tissue. The myocardium is going to be the muscle layer. It makes up 95% of the heart wall. It is very important because, again, it's all muscle. It's what allows the heart to pump and essentially beat. So it's going to be that contractile tissue. The endocardium is going to be the innermost layer. It is made up of endothelium, and it has a smooth inner lining for the chambers of the heart. This is going to minimize friction as the heart has blood moving through it. And then here is the graphic that I promised. So this is the flow of blood through the heart. I do want you to know all of this, and I've gone over it a few times. This is just a nice little diagram showing the flow of blood through the heart. I want you to know essentially everything on this little, for lack of a better term, flow chart. So know it from start to finish. I want you to also know where there's going to be high oxygen versus low oxygen. Remember, everywhere in blue, you're essentially going to have low oxygen because those are typically going to be your veins, typically. Again, that's changes a little bit because you have those pulmonary veins bringing highly oxygenated blood back into the heart. Your arteries are typically going to have high oxygenated blood, except for the pulmonary artery, which is taking blood to the lungs to be oxygenated. So again, that rule doesn't really work when you say veins have low oxygen, arteries have high oxygen. Those are the two exceptions, the pulmonary arteries and the pulmonary veins. One contains the opposite of what your normal veins and arteries contain. So there we go. Do know that your lungs and your capillaries is where you have gas exchange. Either you're picking up oxygen or you're dropping off carbon dioxide, or you're doing the opposite, picking up carbon dioxide and dropping off oxygen. So make sure you know what's going on there, which is gas exchange. Okay. Okay, moving into the cardiac cycle. Not a whole lot I want you to know about this other than you have diastole and systole. Diastole is going to be the relaxed period of the cardiac cycle where blood flows into the heart. Systole is going to have two phases, but both of them involve contraction. You have atrial systole and ventricular systole. This is where you have the contraction of the atria, which is going to push blood from the atrium into the ventricle, and then you have ventricular contraction, where the ventricle is going to squeeze and push blood from the ventricle into one of the primary blood vessels, whether that's the pulmonary artery or the pulmonary vein, or the aorta. So when the ventricles contract, that's going to push blood into the pulmonary vein or into the aorta. So, as I promised, heartbeat sounds. So lub is going to be produced when your atrioventricular valves snap shut, and dup is going to occur when the semilunar valves close. So, as I said, those valves, when they relax and contract due to the papillary muscles and the chordae tendineae, when they close, it's literally snapping shut. So it snaps shut so hard, it makes a noise, which is honestly pretty cool, in my opinion. But do know that technically heartbeat sounds, when we talk about it in anatomy, is lub-dup. Your heart beats around 60 to 100 times a minute. This is when you are more relaxed. When you're sleeping, it's a little bit less, and when you are working out or maybe going up a pair of stairs or a flight of stairs, it might increase. So you have bradycardia, which is a term that refers to a slower than normal heart rate, so less than 60 beats per minute, or tachycardia, which is a faster heart rate than normal, which is going to be greater than 100 beats per minute. And then this little graphic is just showing lubbed up. We've talked about cardiac muscle tissue before, but I'd be remiss if I didn't bring it up again. Remember that cardiac muscle tissue is involuntary. You don't control it. It is branched and striated. That is what separates it from the other two types of muscle tissue. And do make a note that there is a lot of mitochondria. It's very important for there to be an excessive amount of mitochondria. If you remember, mitochondria contain ATP, or they produce ATP, right? Which ATP is just energy. And energy is incredibly important for a muscle that is constantly moving and constantly contracting and working for you. You need a lot of mitochondria to produce a lot of energy for that. You have intercalated discs as well, and I've told you before, they're one of my favorite things to find under a microscope. Intercalated discs are going to be these little lines that you see throughout this tissue, and it is what coordinates all of the cardiac muscle cells. They are very important for cell-to-cell communication. This is not necessarily the process in which your heart maintains its pace. We're not going to go into that too much, but those are nodes that cause your heart to beat. You have pacemaker cells as well, which is going to coordinate that as well. And when those pacemaker cells get out of sync, that is when you need to apply electricity typically. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when it comes to defibrillators. Reading a heart beating, essentially, is going to be through an ECG, which is called an electrocardiogram. It is used to detect and diagnose arrhythmias, so make sure you make a note that arrhythmia means abnormal heartbeats, and you have different waves, and I do want you to know them in order and what they represent. The P wave, so this first little blip that you have, is going to be the electrical signal produced at the beginning of systole. So this is the start of atrial valves contracting. Next is the QRS complex. So that is that kind of typical what you think of when you think of an ECG. This is where you have ventricular contraction shortly after an R wave. And then the T wave, that last little wave there, is going to be where the ventricles relax at the beginning of diastole. A few matters of the heart. A heart murmur is where you have swishing or whistling sounds when you listen to someone's heart beating. This is caused by the valves malfunctioning. So one or more of the valves are allowing blood to leak through. They are not closing all the way. So blood is leaking through, and that is going to cause a swishing or whistling sound. A stroke is classified as a small cranial arterial bursting or being blocked by an embolus. This can cause a lack of oxygen to the brain and eventually brain damage. Heart failure is damage to the heart via heart attacks, along with coronary circulation problems, and we'll talk about that a little bit more here in just a bit. And then you can go into cardiac arrest, which is the heart suddenly stopping beating. This can be caused by a bevy of things. A whole lot of things can cause your heart to stop beating. Anything, really. I mean, a massive impact to your chest, maybe electricity if you get electrocuted. It kind of just depends what might cause cardiac arrest. And then again, arrhythmia is just an unusual heart rhythm. Moving on to matters of the heart, when it is broken. This is not due to sadness. This is due to any of the issues that we just discussed. When it comes to the term CPR, this is cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Please make a note that CPR is chest compressions that force blood through the vascular system. It allows the organs to stay oxygenated, especially your brain. When applied to someone who has stopped breathing or the heart has stopped beating. CPR or mouth-to-mouth or anything that goes along with CPR is not to get the heart to start beating. This is exclusively to keep your organs oxygenated until you can apply something that can cause the heart to start beating again. So defibrillators, which is one of the hardest words for me to say, is metal paddles that deliver a strong electric current to the chest. Usually what happens is either the heart stops beating or it's beating out of sync. So blood isn't going anywhere because the chambers aren't coordinated. Those pacemaker cells are out of pace. They're not matching up. A defibrillator is going to cause your heart to stop beating and then to restart. That's the hope, at least. It is going to cause the heart to hopefully start back up in sync altogether. It's almost like restarting your computer when you have problems or restarting your phone because it's freaking out. It's just a way to try to get everything back on the same page and get it going and working properly again. So answering one of the first questions from this lecture, and that is, can you die of a broken heart? And the answer is very sadly yes. There is a condition called broken heart syndrome. It is also known as stress-induced cardiomyopathy. Women are more susceptible to this condition. It feels like a heart attack, even though it isn't one, but it is a chamber of the heart enlarging and not being able to pump as well. It is treatable, but it can be caused from the loss of a loved one, the loss of a home, something traumatic, but it does happen, unfortunately. Here are some of the coronary vessels. These are vessels that are going to both supply and take away low oxygenated blood to and from the heart. So what you can see is that some of these vessels are coming right off of the aorta, and that's very important to make a note of. Remember that the aorta is getting blood fresh from the lungs. These are going to be red blood cells that are in the highest capacity of oxygen. So they are going to be holding a ton of oxygen. And so this really highly oxygenated blood is coming right off of the aorta and going to the heart itself to keep it nice and oxygenated. And of course, you have these veins here that are going to pick up that low oxygenated blood and all that carbon dioxide that it's going to produce and putting it straight back into the heart to be reoxygenated. Do make a note that a heart attack is going to be blockage of blood flow, potentially by a blood clot of the coronary blood vessels, which can be very bad. So do keep in mind that we do need these blood vessels to supply blood to the heart, and if they aren't able to do that, then we have a problem, big one. So a little bit more about coronary circulation and bypass surgery. So if one of the major arteries becomes blocked, then it can be bypassed. Excuse me. If there are multiple blockages, then you're going to need multiple bypasses. So if you ever have known someone who needed a bypass, coronary bypass surgery, this is kind of what it is. I'm not going to go into too much more about it, but there are two terms I want you to know. Arteriosclerosis, which is where your arteries harden. They are going to become thicker or tougher. And then atherosclerosis, which is fatty degeneration. What this is the formation of fat deposits in your arterial tunica media. So that is one of the layers of your arteries. Moving on to blood specifically. I'm so sorry about my cats, oh gosh. Let's ask the question, is blood edible? Enjoy the sideshow. I'm so sorry. Is blood edible? So let's start with the function of blood. We've talked about it before. In the circulatory system, one of our main functions is going to be transportation. From there, transportation can include oxygen, water, medication, carbon dioxide, waste removal, transportation of a lot of things, honestly. One of the other functions is to regulate your pH balance and ion composition, to restrict fluid loss, to act as a defense, so think of your immune system and white blood cells, and to maintain your body temperature. The composition of blood is, once again, think about connective tissue. When we're talking about connective tissues, one of the connective tissues is blood. It is your liquid connective tissue. That means it's going to be composed of a few things. First is going to be plasma. Plasma makes up the majority of your blood composition at 55%. This is going to contain water, mostly water, proteins, hormones, ions, gases, nutrients, and waste. The other percentage is 45% formed elements. Your formed elements is probably what you mostly think of when you think of blood, such as red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Now, at the bottom, you may see characters from a show. If you know it, awesome. If you don't, you should watch it. It's pretty cute. It's called Cells at Work. It's on Netflix, I believe. Probably also on Hulu, and if you watch anime, Funimation, or Crunchyroll, also have it. But it's a really adorable show that is relatively accurate, actually, following the two characters on the far left of the screen, a red blood cell and a white blood cell. So if you're feeling up for it, especially for this section, it's the perfect time to get into anime, and it's a pretty good one. The little children characters there in the middle, those are platelets, which is adorable. Platelets are cell fragments, so it's adorable that they're represented as children in this show. It's quite cute. I think you'd enjoy it. If you haven't seen it, give it a try. So let's talk a little bit more about plasma. Plasma is going to be a yellowish liquid composed of mostly water. It will be the vehicle for drug distribution. If you take pain medication or say birth control or any type of medication really, this is what is going to transport that medication throughout your body. It also is going to contain hormones and electrolytes. The proteins that it contains, some of the most important ones I've listed out, globulins, so don't confuse that for the word goblin. These are globulins. These are transport proteins and antibodies, also known as immunoglobulins. These are proteins that will attack foreign items and are produced by white blood cells. Albumins, many will transport other proteins and help to maintain osmotic balance, so your water balance. Fibrinogen is a precursor to fibrin, and the purpose of it is for clotting. So if you get a tear or a break in a blood vessel, you are going to need fibrin in order to create a clot. Within our formed elements, there's a few things that we need to know before we jump in. Formed elements are going to be created in your red bone marrow. Very, very important. We've talked about red bone marrow before, and one of the purposes of bone marrow is hematopoiesis. So hemopoiesis is that process of making blood. You have a hemocytoblast, which are going to be all formed elements, are formed from these stem cells. So hemocytoblasts are like baby blood cells, baby white blood cells, baby red blood cells, and baby platelets, if you will. You do have a few other cells. I do want you to know loosely, but not as important as the hemocytoblast. Kind of subcategories, we have lymphoid stem cells, which are going to produce lymphocytes, which are a type of white blood cells. Some remain in your red bone marrow, and others migrate to your lymphatic system and within the lymphoid tissue, such as in the thymus, the spleen, and your lymph nodes. Myeloid stem cells are going to divide and give rise to all types of formed elements other than lymphocytes. So as I said, hemocytoblasts include both of these, but myeloid stem cells are going to be specifically everything else except for lymphocytes. So moving on to red blood cells. These are also known as erythrocytes. Erythro means red, cyte means cell. It literally just translates into red cell. These cells are going to give your blood its red color. A single drop of blood is going to contain about 260 million red blood cells. That is a lot, right? The average adult is going to contain about 25 trillion red blood cells, which is kind of astounding, and especially once we start talking about how red blood cells carry oxygen, trying to calculate how much oxygen your body can contain. It's pretty cool. So their purpose, and I kind of just gave it away, spoiler alert, is to shuttle oxygen. Oxygen is very important to your body. You need it for a lot of processes, and not just shuttling oxygen, but picking up carbon dioxide and carrying it away, because that is a waste product that most of your tissues produce. It needs oxygen and will produce carbon dioxide as a waste. A few important things to note about red blood cells is that they lack a nucleus and other organelles. This is going to give the red blood cell that kind of donutty, kind of depressed center. It's going to make them very flexible as well. And remember how big a capillary is. Capillaries are super tiny, only about one red blood cell at a time can fit through. Now, this might sound kind of weird, but it is important to make a note of that red blood cells can squeeze through those capillaries because they are flexible, lacking a nucleus and organelles, and because the capillaries are so small. So let's talk about hemoglobin. And you might be thinking, well, isn't hemoglobin red blood cells? I've heard this term before. Hemoglobin is actually what makes up red blood cells. So hemoglobin is a protein. Its purpose is to carry oxygen, and it's made up of 4 chains, and each chain holds an iron atom. Now, you don't need to know the beta 1, beta 2, alpha 1, alpha 2 chains. I don't care if you know that. Just know that you have these 4 chains of globin. And let me get my little marker out here. So you have 4 chains of globin. In the center of a globin, you have a heme group. So there are 4 heme groups. Attached to a heme group, right at the very center of that heme group, is going to be an iron molecule. And iron can hold 2 oxygen. A single hemoglobin can contain 8 oxygen molecules. Now, these hemoglobin, quite a few of them, make up a single red blood cell. So, if we do the math, one hemoglobin has 4 heme groups, meaning it can contain 2 oxygen, which in total is 8 oxygen molecules, right? So, if you have 280 million hemoglobin making up a single red blood cell, we multiply that by 4. That means we're going to get somewhere over 1 billion oxygen molecules. So kind of keep that in mind, how that math kind of works out. But honestly, the only thing I really, really desperately want you to know is that one hemoglobin can hold 8 oxygen. Moving on to white blood cells. White blood cells are also known as leukocytes, which just translates into white cell. They are larger than red blood cells, and this is important because they serve a very important purpose of protecting your body from foreign pathogens. They contain organelles, unlike red blood cells, and they're part of the immune system. They are longer lived, but not as numerous as red blood cells, so they will live longer in your body, but there's not as many white blood cells as there are red blood cells. Their purposes include removing toxins, waste, damaged cells, whatever might be included in that. This could be viruses, bacteria, it could be foreign cells. It just depends. And there are multiple types of white blood cells. I do want you to know all the types of white blood cells and what their purpose is. So first we have neutrophils. Neutrophils make up about 50% of all the white blood cells. They are the first line of defense that you have. They use phagocytosis, where they surround and engulf invaders, and they are going to attack smaller items like bacteria and viruses. Eosinophils make up 5% of all white blood cells, and they attack larger pathogens like tapeworms and flukes. And I do have these little monsters here over in the bottom corner. I do believe the segmented one is a fluke and a tapeworm is not segmented, kind of like an earthworm, if you could think of that. Eosinophils are also going to aid in allergies. So if you have an allergic reaction, these are going to respond to that allergic reaction. An example of that would be like during springtime, or for some reason this past autumn was particularly bad. If you're watching this later than spring 2020 or autumn 2020, autumn 2020 was pretty bad. Basophils are going to make up 1% of white blood cells, and they secrete histamine. This is going to trigger an inflammation response. So if you've heard of taking an antihistamine is going to basically build up in your system. So if you're taking allergy medication, and you're hoping that your Zyrtec or Benadryl or something like that is going to kick in immediately. It doesn't. It won't really help if you only take one, but if you start taking your antihistamines for a little bit longer than, say, maybe 2 weeks, the antihistamines will build up in your body and cause your allergic reaction. If it's to pollen or maybe dogs or anything like that, it will build up in your system and make it to where you don't have as much of an inflammation reaction. Monocytes are going to be very large white blood cells, and I like to think of them kind of as the garbage trucks of the formed elements world. They use phagocytosis. They're going to engulf damaged cells and larger invaders. They are very mature macrophages, which macrophages are another type of white blood cell, but let's just say monocytes and call it a day. Lymphocytes are the last white blood cell. These are going to produce proteins and antibodies, and they are going to attach to pathogens through T cells and B cells. I don't know that we're going to go into much about T cells and B cells. We may, I'm just not sure quite yet. So moving on to platelets, also known as thrombocytes. These are going to be membrane-bound cell fragments. They contain no nucleus, and they are formed by megakaryocytes. Now, just know that that's what they are, but don't worry about that for now. They are going to really help when it comes to blood clotting. They get sticky and stick together. They use a fibrin net. Remember, we were talking fibrin earlier. And so what happens is they form a nice sticky fibrin net, which is going to cause red blood cells and other platelets to stick together, and it's going to patch up this area until it can be healed. Very sadly, platelets only live for about 3 to 5 days, but you produce about 200 billion a day. So they replenish themselves very quickly. This might be one of the cutest things in anatomy, to be perfectly honest, but it's a blood cell family tree. So we have that starting cell, the hemocytoblast, our myeloid versus lymphoid starting cells, and that is how we get our lymphocytes, as well as our natural killer cells, which again, not sure that we're going to get into that too much, but they are part of your immune system. We may talk about it later. Still kind of deciding. From our myeloid stem cells, you can see that megakaryocyte, which is going to then break apart and form our platelets or thrombocytes. You can see how we get an erythrocyte, and then all of our white blood cells. So you can see how all of them are formed, where they come from. I think it's really quite interesting seeing their relationships. So yeah, hope you enjoy it as much as I think it is enjoyable. So talking about blood, I would be remiss to not bring up malaria. Malaria is going to be a parasite found in the saliva of mosquitoes. This parasite is going to infect the liver and multiply. It is one of the oldest human diseases known to man as of right now. It infects your red blood cells in order to hide from white blood cells. So they kind of use your red blood cells as a mask. They will infiltrate the red blood cell, multiply, and then burst out, which is going to cause a powerful immune response. So as they are hiding in the red blood cells, the white blood cells can't find them. They multiply, burst out, breaking your red blood cells, and then you have a powerful immune response. And then once that immune response is over, what's left over is going to hide in your remaining red blood cells. They're going to multiply, then burst out, cause an immune response, and keep doing that until either you're cured or you die, or somewhere in between. I'm not quite sure what happens, but either you get cured or you perish. What that can cause, though, due to the parasite breaking your red blood cells, it causes something called anemia. Anemia is going to be an extreme decline of red blood cells. What this can cause in form of symptoms is fatigue, weakness, and breathlessness. It is a reduced capacity of oxygen delivery, so there's a substantial amount of oxygen not being taken to your various tissues in your body. So that's not good. This is an example of a negative feedback loop. If you remember when we were talking about homeostasis at the beginning of the semester and talking about positive and negative feedback loops. Remember that when it comes to a positive feedback loop, that's like peeing or birth, and negative feedback loops are like thermoregulation. Well, this is another one that goes under negative feedback loops is anemia. Some things that can cause anemia is heavy bleeding. This can be through menstruation or potentially a wound. It can be gastrointestinal ulcers, which are wounds in the intestines that bleed into the intestinal cavity, or this could also be iron deficiency based. One of the types of anemia is sickle cell anemia, if you've ever heard of that. But it is where you have misshapen red blood cells. On the left here, we can see a normal red blood cell, and on the right is a sickled red blood cell. It kind of makes a crescent shape, but back in the day, they thought it looked like the farming tool, a sickle, which is what that tool underneath is, and that is where it got its name. This is where the misshapen red blood cells die early, as well as they don't hold oxygen molecules the way that a normal red blood cell does. So this causes anemia in the fact that you don't have as many red blood cells and there's not as much oxygen getting to the tissues as necessary. Symptoms include pain, infection, and fatigue. Treatments include blood transfusions, medication, and rarely, but also in extreme cases, bone marrow transplants. So speaking of transplants, let's talk about blood types and why they're important. The most common blood type is O positive. The most rare blood type is AB negative. And the oldest blood type is A. When we talk about Rh factors, we're talking about whether or not there's a positive or negative going with your blood type. The blood types that we are going to talk about are A, B, AB, and O. They are specifically called these things due to the studs of sugars and proteins that are on your tissues and your red blood cells. A, B, and AB, you have these sugars. On O, there are no sugars produced. So I am going to pose a question to you. Why would there be a need for different blood types? The reason that we need different blood types, and potentially why that arose through evolution, is that if everybody was the exact same in their blood type, let's say everybody was A positive, then if there was a condition where A positive blood was susceptible to a particular disease or susceptible to a particular, I don't know, anything, then everybody would die. But if you have genetic variation in this sense, then potentially, you get some individuals that are able to pass on their genetic information. So if everybody's A, everybody dies. If you have some people who are A and some people who are B, some people who are AB, potentially the B members will survive while the A members die, and it's probably going to be a toss-up in the AB. So, kind of important to have some genetic variation even when it comes to blood. This graphic is fantastic in that it shows the antigens that that type of blood contain, as well as the antibodies. So in type A, studded along the cells, tissues, this doesn't just include the red blood cells. This is going to include kind of all the tissues in your body. It lets your body know that it's supposed to be there, that it's yours. So I kind of like to think of these as sort of like little puzzle pieces. With antigen A in type A red blood cells, you have this particular shape of these antigens that are studded along the cells. Floating around, not attached to anything, is going to be anti-B antibodies. Now, the purpose of these antibodies within the plasma is going to be to make sure that you get no antigen B cells into the system, because it doesn't want that. It's not going to be copacetic. It's not going to vibe well. So in type B, you have the exact opposite happening, where you have antigen B studs along all the tissued cells, and then you have anti-A antibodies that are going to be within the plasma. So think of it this way. I am type A blood. If my boyfriend is type B, which I don't know his blood type, but let's just say it's B. If he's type B and he wants to give me a blood transfusion, his blood is not going to be able to mix with mine because I am A, and I have those specific little rounded studs on my red blood cells. If they give me his blood, and it's not filtered, let's say, so I get his antigen B studded red blood cells and his plasma, which has the anti-A antibodies, his anti-A antibodies are going to be able to attach, because if you look at that, they're nice and rounded at the top. They will attach to my antigen A studs, as well as my anti-B antibodies, the way that they are shaped, will attach to his antigen B studs. What that is going to cause is an immune response as well as clotting, which is not to say that they're going to all clump together. That can be the case, but essentially clotting in this case is going to be just kind of a reaction. A reaction is going to occur, and it's not going to be a good one. So my body is going to reject his blood, and therefore, if I needed the blood, chances are I'm in a situation where I'm probably not doing too good. So this immune response would be particularly bad. Now, what's interesting, when you have a combination of A-B blood, you have both the A and B antigens. What that means is you can't have any anti-A or anti-B antibodies, because if you had one or another or both, it would attack its own red blood cells or its cells in general, because it would have something to attach to. If you have anti-A antibodies, it's going to attach to those antigen A studs on the AB blood. Now, what's even more interesting, we're taking it another step up, is we have type O blood. Type O is going to have neither antigen, but it's going to have both anti-A and anti-B antibodies, because it doesn't want either one of those things in there, because neither one are there in the first place, which is kind of cool and interesting. So hopefully, if you know your blood type, now you know a little bit more about yourself. And I believe the next slide is going to tell us a little bit more about antigens. But we kind of just covered all of that. Let's move on. There we go. This is what I was hoping was next. So we have blood types and who they can donate to and who they can receive blood from. I want you to know this slide. I think it's important to know who can receive what from where and who you can give to. So if you're ever in a situation where someone needs a transfusion, and maybe it's not necessarily in a hospital, because in a hospital they check, double check, and triple check to make sure they have the correct blood types going to the correct recipient. So I think it's important to know these things. If you know your blood type, definitely know who you can take blood from and who you can donate blood to. One of the things that you should kind of take a peek at is that AB positive can receive blood from every blood type. It's the universal recipient. Meanwhile, you have O negative blood, which can donate blood to everybody. It's the universal donor. Those two are the very, very important blood types. If you have O negative, chances are you are constantly being harassed by various groups trying to get you to donate blood, just because you can save a lot of lives. I think it's important to donate blood if you're able to, as much as you can, unless you have a condition or anything like that that makes it to where you can't. You should try to do it. It's a good feeling after you donate blood. Also, if you've never donated blood and you don't know your blood type, if you donate blood at the Red Cross, they'll tell you your blood type for free. So you get a little card, tells you what your blood type is. I think it's kind of cool, and it's also a good cause. So something that can happen when it comes to a difference of blood type in a pregnancy. This is called hemolytic disease of a newborn. This is where the blood type of the fetus is different than the blood type of the mother. Now, if you know a little bit about pregnancy, you know that the blood of the mother is what supplies the fetus with nutrients, oxygen, anything that the fetus needs as it is growing and developing. Typically, your blood type is going to be determined by the genes of both parents, but the first child that a woman is pregnant with typically is going to have the same Rh factor, so that positive or negative. The second child can have a tendency to not be the same Rh factor, and that is this hemolytic disease. It is where the blood type is different from the mother, and what this can cause is for the mother's body to reject the fetus. Now, it doesn't really matter too much for whether or not the blood type of the mother is A and the baby is B. The anti-A and anti-B antibodies are too large to cross the placenta, so that connection between mother and fetus. But what can cross are the anti-Rh antibodies. So if you're positive or negative, you have antibodies kind of going against that. So those can cross and will attack the fetus's red blood cells. So that is where that becomes a problem. There are medications for women to take if this is the case, if this happens. So just be aware if you have a child with someone, or if you become pregnant, do make sure to be aware of the second child and making sure that you don't have this hemolytic disease. Blood clotting. So we did mention this ever so slightly before. This is where platelets are very important. Remember, they are going to become sticky, stick together, use a fibrin net, and clog up whatever is being torn and releasing red blood cells and plasma. This process is called hemostasis. This is the process to stem the flow of blood out of a damaged blood vessel. And a blood clot is going to be composed of a fibrin net of blood cells and platelets. So you can almost kind of think of, if you've ever gotten a cut, how right after you get the cut and you get that clot forming over the top of the cut, if you kind of pick that away, I know kind of gross to think about, but if you pick away that clot right away, you start bleeding again until you form another clot. This is why it's important not to pick at scabs. One, you can get an infection. That clot, that scab, is protecting your inside from the outside world. That's what your skin is doing at all times, is protecting you from any pathogens, bacteria, viruses, microorganisms, anything from the inside of your body. You are being protected by your skin. That is what clots do. Don't pick at your scabs. You can get a bad infection. So, what happens at the end of a red blood cell's life? Thankfully, we actually recycle them. So they don't just disappear into the ether. We don't give them a little Viking funeral for each red blood cell. What happens is at the end of a red blood cell's life, it becomes less flexible than it needs to be, and it's not able to fit through those capillaries. About 1% of your circulating red blood cells are replaced each day, so that should give you an idea of how much you actually recycle. About 3 million new red blood cells enter circulation each second. That's a lot, and it's also very important. A red blood cell's lifespan is about 120 days. That is around the time we put them out to pasture. So these kind of old, damaged red blood cells are going to go to the liver and spleen. And I know we haven't talked about these organs just yet, but this is one of their purposes. They actually have multiple. What happens is our old damaged red blood cells are engulfed by macrophages. We want to transport that iron to your bone marrow in order to make new red blood cells from that iron. Proteins and lipids from your red blood cells are disassembled through active transport and fat synthesis. And your heme groups get excreted. And this is going to be in the form of bile from your liver. Which, if you know a little bit about kind of that process, that bile is going to be stored in your gallbladder. Some clotting disorders, because this can happen, as well as sort of just blood disorders in general, a little bit to talk about. We have thrombosis, which is where you have a blood clot that remains in place. This is kind of important because if that clot breaks apart or dislodges and travels through the bloodstream, it can cause an embolism. An embolism can kind of show up anywhere. Unfortunately, they happen pretty frequently after a surgery. An embolism can cause problems if it causes a clot in your brain, if it causes a clot in your lungs, especially after surgery. Your body is still recovering, kind of weak. An embolism is very bad. Hemorrhaging is classified as uncontrolled bleeding. Shock is sort of a result of a hemorrhage, and that is inadequate blood flow to your organs. You're not getting enough oxygen and carbon dioxide is not being taken away. Sepsis is widespread pathogenic infection of body tissues. And septicemia is blood poisoning, or sepsis of the blood. There are two types of kind of an infection of the blood. That's bacteremia and viremia. Both are referring to bacteria or viruses, respectively. And then the one that I didn't mention because I skipped over it and just kept going because that's what you're supposed to do, is hemophilia. Hemophilia is poor or no blood clot formation, and this is a trait that can be inherited. Something that I thought would be interesting to mention in this lecture is blood doping. Blood doping is something that is kind of popular among athletes, and I don't mean every athlete does it. I'm just saying that if you're not an athlete, you probably don't blood dope. But this is the process in which you remove your red blood cells so that your red blood cell count returns to normal. And then prior to an event, is what that's supposed to say, you re-inject the erythrocytes or red blood cells back into your system. What this results in is increased performance because you have an increased oxygen delivery to muscles. The downside is that you're kind of overloading your body with red blood cells, and this is going to increase your blood viscosity, so the thickness of your blood. This is going to cause your heart to work a lot harder and can put a lot of strain on your heart. So excess blood doping is not good. You will damage your heart, as well as it is a form of cheating. So, I mean, if you're an athlete, don't do it. It might sound like something cool that all the kids are doing. Don't do it. It's bad for your heart. Here is a list of abnormal white blood cell counts. So this kind of goes hand in hand with leukemia, which I don't believe I necessarily talk about, but do kind of keep that in mind. Your total white blood cell count should be between 5,000 and 10,000 white blood cells per microliter. Less is called leukopenia, and if you have more than that amount, it is leukocytosis. You do have these various types of problems if you have more or less of that particular type of white blood cell. And instead of just sitting here and reading them off to you, you can read them yourself at another time or while I'm talking here. A few blood facts that I think are important and honestly pretty cool. You contain, as a 150 to 180 pound human adult, around 1.5 gallons or 10 pints. What is interesting from those numbers is you can donate 1 pint every 56 days. You can do double red every 112 days. You need more time to replenish those. And if you are bleeding out, which would be terrifying, I hope you never experience that, you can lose somewhere around 40% of your blood before you die. And remember, if you don't have enough blood going to your organs, that is called shock. You do not want that. So 40% of your blood in the form of gallons is about 0.5 gallons. The color of your blood is different. If you can right now, I want you to take a look at your wrist. I want you to kind of tilt your hand back so that the skin on your wrist is a little bit more apparent. You can kind of stretch it back and see what's underneath. If you're looking at your wrist, you can probably see these blue vessels that are underneath. There is a difference between your colors in your blood. So if you have lighter blood, that is going to be more oxygenated. That's going to be found mainly in your arteries. If you have darker blood, like what you can see in your wrist, and I don't know if you can see mine. Yeah, you can see them pretty good. Those darker blue vessels are going to be your veins. This is going to be low oxygenated blood. So you can tell a difference between higher oxygen and lower oxygen blood based on the color. So sometimes you can see your veins in your elbow crook. That is what nurses and doctors are going to aim for when they take blood out of you. Hopefully in a legal and purposeful way, instead of trying to steal it or something like that. Bruises. Bruises are going to be known as hematomas. Hematomas are just clotted blood from broken blood vessels underneath. So this is going to be, I'm sure you've experienced a bruise at some point in your life. They have a tendency to look like this picture, but this is also a healing bruise, and you can tell by the kind of yellowish border that it has. So bruises can be caused by injury or trauma to blood vessels. This can include getting hit, kicked, punched. Hickeys are also a form of bruise. So however you receive a hickey, no judgment here. It is damaged vessels underneath, and those damaged vessels are leaking blood underneath your skin. Treatment for most bruises is going to be rice, so that is rest, ice, what is C? Compression and elevation. I always forget C for some reason. And if you bruise easily, some of the reasons might be you're taking too many blood thinners, such as aspirin, fish oil, and ginkgo oil. You may be low in vitamin C. If you sunbathe excessively, this can cause damage to the thickness of your skin and therefore the vessels underneath. So do be careful with sunning yourselves or tanning. It is important to take care of your skin, both for cancer reasons as well as bruising reasons. Intense exercise can tear your blood vessels, so do kind of be conscientious of how hard you push yourself. And heavy drinking can also cause bruising more easily. So this is damage to the liver, which is going to affect your clotting factors that are produced by your liver. Moving on to blood and alcohol. First and foremost, I have to say this, and I don't mean to sound very motherly, but never drink and drive. If you feel buzzed at all, it's not worth it. You might hurt yourself, and more importantly, your bad choices could hurt somebody else. So keep that in mind as you go through life, and if you're not quite 21 yet, make good choices. It could be your life or someone else's in your own hands. So talking about blood alcohol content, this is going to be determined by how much of what type of alcohol went into what type of body. Now, a lot of that sounds very confusing, but I want you to think of it this way. Currently, I'm about 180 pounds. I'm 5'5½". I'm also a female. What that means is I don't really have a crazy high tolerance for alcohol. I could drink maybe one beer and be drunk. Meanwhile, my boyfriend, who is, I think he's about 130 pounds, he's 5'7", he drinks half a beer and he's drunk. So kind of think about how your height and your weight may affect how much alcohol you can drink. Also think about what type of alcohol. If you are drinking a beer that is only, I don't know, somewhere less than, 8% alcohol, and that might even be much given certain beers, you have to kind of take that into account. Meanwhile, you have Everclear, which is 100% alcohol, or like 99.9%. That stuff is crazy and terrifying and probably shouldn't be consumed. But regardless, you have different types of alcohol that, unless you kind of know your body, they can affect you differently based on your height, weight, and your sex. Do keep in mind that 0.08%, which sounds like a really small percentage, but it can make a big difference. Remember, we were talking about the blood barrier between your brain and your blood, and one of the things that can cross is alcohol. So that does get up into your frontal lobe. It can impair your judgment. 0.08% is legally intoxicated, and that is the point where you should not operate heavy machinery. Even if you don't feel drunk per se, but you feel buzzed, don't do something silly. And I'll get off my soapbox now. And finally, last but not least, let's talk about vampires, because we've been talking about blood, why not? Blood can be digested, but only in small amounts. You can build up kind of a tolerance for blood, but to start out with, you should be only consuming like teaspoons of blood. And the reason being is that there's a lot of iron in blood. And we've talked about that when it came to hemoglobin. There are 4 molecules of iron on each hemoglobin. And remember, there's 280 million hemoglobin that make up one red blood cell. And you have, I don't know, a couple billion red blood cells in your body. If you're just sitting there sipping on a glass of blood and you've never done that before, that is a lot of iron that you're consuming. Humans don't have a way to properly extract excess amounts of iron from the food that we eat. So, too much of anything consumed by a human or put into our body can become toxic. Little side note, you don't naturally have toxins in your body. That's a misconception majorly. So if you take products or use products that are supposed to extract toxins from your body, it's fake. It's not real. It's literally just a way for these companies to make money. There's not actually toxins in your body, and if you had any toxins in your body naturally gets rid of these things through your kidneys and through other means, but specifically your kidneys are going to be filtering out anything that your body doesn't need. So don't put onions in your socks. It doesn't pull out toxins through your feet. Don't take products that are supposed to cleanse you. Chances are it's just going to give you diarrhea, which is not cleansing you of anything other than water. Just kind of make good choices. One of the other things that these products claim is they're taking out toxins, but they never tell you what toxins they're removing because there aren't any. So keep that in mind. Don't eat too much blood and don't fall for the toxin trick. And with that, we're going to conclude the cardiovascular system. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and you make good choices.